floor. Thank you for the opportunity to say just a few words about how and why voting rights for EU citizens matter. What I'm going to do is give you 5 reasons why I think they matter. These are of varying degrees of direct practical relevance, and some of them are somewhat more less of direct practical relevance, although they might be in the future. And what I'm going to try to avoid doing is to trespass in the area of the discussion that will come from my colleagues Jan Niesen and Fidel Guerresiba, who will talk more about this from the perspective of people involved in NGO work and from the point of view of activism and campaigns. So I've just got 5 reasons to study EU electoral rights. The first issue, I think, is that it shows you very clearly that EU citizenship isn't just something which exists up in the ether under EU law, but it's very much an example of multi-level citizenship, where not only the rules at the EU level, but rules and practices at the national and the subnational and the local level also apply. And that's not to say that EU citizenship should somehow be regarded as sort of somehow constantly under threat from the limitations of national law or local rules and local practices, but that there's a constant interaction between these different levels which produces the practices within which people express themselves in some way as European citizens. But in addition to that, EU citizenship also provides a case study with its voting rights and the right to stand for election in local elections and also in European Parliament elections. Seems to me to challenge in certain ways standard models justifying political participation of non-nationals on the basis of, for example, the integration of immigrants, which is the standard model. It just doesn't work, for example, when you look at the extension of local electoral rights to European Parliament electoral rights, because that's done essentially on the political basis that the European Parliament is the citizens' parliament, and that's the fundamental justification for that. The second reason for studying local electoral rights is that it's by adding the European dimension to the study of decisions about political participation of non-nationals in the context of national politics, which focuses, as I just noted, particularly on the integration of immigrants. This adds another dimension to understanding the character and the types of debates in the national political context. The integration of the political participation of non-nationals is quite frequently studied by academics in the context of particularly political science, but it's rather rare that the European dimension, which to a certain extent in a way adds an international relations element to that, it's rather rare that the European dimension is fully taken into account in that context. The third reason for studying EU electoral rights is that it is a really rather interesting laboratory of political participation by non-nationals. And it can help us to understand more about the effects and the character of wide-scale participation by non-nationals across a large number of states, which are interrelated by their common membership of the EU. So there is this tension, as I said, between, in a way, understanding this as a sort of an internal politics issue, but also the international relations dimension of it that comes through EU membership. And so in that context, given what a large laboratory, what an interesting laboratory this potentially is, it's astonishing how little we know about the political participation of EU citizens in elections in other member states. We know very little qualitatively, we know very little quantitatively, and we don't even have a full database of provisions and rules relating to that, and this is something that the UDO Citizenship Observatory would very much like to do. We plan to do that in the future. It's really rather hard to get data, and the Commission isn't particularly effective at collecting it because the Member States don't seem to always provide it. And in that context, we're always very grateful, I think, for those of us who are interested in this question, for the interest that the European Parliament takes on this question. So then those are issues, as it were, that focus particularly on the character of political participation and the question of what are the boundaries of the demos from the perspective, particularly of it around the issue of migration, whether that's intra-EU migration or migration of third country nationals to the EU member states. But I think that my fourth reason why we should study EU political electoral rights is that studying and understanding them better will help us to understand a little bit more about the character of the Europolity. And the trajectory of electoral rights may also tell us something about the trajectory towards political integration in the European Union context, and in that context we can then exchange reasons and justifications for higher or lower degrees of political participation, of political integration in that context. So there are often demands at the edges of the existing electoral rights for future developments. Should the EU be moving in the direction of promoting political participation of EU citizens in national elections at the level, or should there be some form of more comprehensive expatriate voting in national elections within the EU, which there isn't at the moment? As the previous panel showed, this is something of a patchwork, both in practice but also around the arguments that are made in that area. And in addition to that, issues around the political participation of permanent resident third country nationals is often raised, and what is the role, or could be the role, of EU law in relation to that? What are the edges of EU competence in that context? And relating that back to the discussion yesterday about the European Citizens Initiative, is this an area for potential political activism as well? And then finally, and this is most abstrusely, and I've just added this in because of the debate that was taking place at the end of the last session about expatriate voting and about regional elections and so on and so forth. I can never help but always want to note that what's interesting about the EU electoral rights is that when you impose them, if you will, and I don't mean that in a sort of negative way, when you place them on top of the patchwork of different models of political participation in the member states, it can throw up some really interesting outlying cases. So one of those that's most fascinating to me, because I'm an English person resident in Edinburgh, is the fact that EU citizens vote in Scottish Parliament elections, and indeed and have done since the inception of the European Parliament, of the Scottish Parliament in 1998. And indeed, they not only vote in Scottish Parliament elections, but they actually voted in the referendum that established, as it were, or enabled, that triggered the current arrangements for devolution. As things stand at the moment, it will be SNP policy that that EU citizens would vote in, the same electoral register would be the basis for any further referendum on devolution and what's called devolution max, or independence. And this would be in contradistinction using the local electoral register, which has absolutely no expat or external voting in the UK, whereas if you use the Westminster register, you would exclude EU citizens, but you would include Scots who are resident in Ireland, like Derek Hutchison, or in Paris and so on and so forth, but you would exclude Scots who are resident in London and elsewhere in England. So it's a really interesting question, and what is fascinating to me, is endlessly fascinating to me, are the mismatches and interesting questions that emerge once you place superimpose the pattern of EU electoral rights on top of the rather curious patchworks of national voting rights. What that tells you in the longer term, I'm not really sure. Maybe it tells you something about the fact that that models of political participation are rather difficult to sustain in real life. I'm not sure. But anyway, moving on, I'm going to leave the floor now to the much more the NGO focus of Jan Liesen and Fidel Mutuari-Sibo. Thank you very much.